Perfect. Glad to be with you, my friends. We'll jump right in as usual. Have your PowerPoint info for you. We're already here. Just a second. There we go. So last week we looked at the Bread of Life discourse, and that was one that we looked at, but it's super complex, and I think we probably could spend the rest of the fall trying to walk through everything that's going on in that one. There's a whole lot that's happening. Next summer, as I mentioned in that class, next summer there will be 5 consecutive weeks of preaching from the gospel, from the Bread of Life discourse. So maybe we'll unpack it better preaching as well. But so we talked about that. There's a ton happening in that discourse, and we talked about wanting to go back, but I think we're just going to go ahead and press on into chapter 7, just so we can keep a little momentum. But beginning with chapter 7, so the Bread of Life discourses conclude about, this is literally sort of, we have a total scene break and things start again. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He did not wish to go about in Judea because the Jews were looking for an opportunity to kill him. Now, the Jewish festival of booths was near, so his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." Not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify against it that its works are evil. Go to the festival yourselves. I am not going to this festival, for my time has not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. So, this is actually not the only moment we have. This is really, it'll sometimes be even labeled as subsections in your Bible. Sometimes the label this is the rejection of Jesus's brothers. There's people are always surprised, I think, because they assume that his family was on board. Certainly his mom seems to be on board most of the time. Mary's there at the end. She's there at different points throughout. But in Mark 3:21, we also have a moment when his family, and this is a direct quote, when his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying he has gone out of his mind. Literally, you have an image in that case of them trying to get him committed. They think he's gone completely crazy. So the question, of course, then is what happened right before this in Mark? Not a whole lot. He was teaching in the synagogue. He performed an exorcism. He appointed the 12 and had been healing people, but things were starting to take off, right? So what we can say in defense of Jesus' siblings, I'm pretty positive that the same thing happened for my brother and sister. If either of them started saying, I'm the Messiah, or I've got all these magic powers and I'm doing this stuff, I might be thinking they're crazy too. It's not too out of the realm of possibility. The other side of it that is very clear in both cases, in this one and in the Mark case, folks are starting to get angry and threaten Jesus and his family. They don't like what he's doing. So there's that kind of time where it might be okay for him to do some healing and teaching, but when suddenly people start talking about coming after you, that conversation changes. So we have, again, this pretty rare moment. It's only 2 times in the Gospels where Jesus' family is pretty seriously questioning what he is. And Jesus, in this text, is also pretty clear that his brothers don't believe in him. Now, we always can pause here and also answer the classic questions before they're asked. In the Episcopal Church, we have absolutely no problem believing that Jesus had brothers and sisters, that Mary had other children after Jesus. It's the Catholic Church that gets concerned about Jesus, Mary being the ever Virgin Mary. And they will typically then, when they see these verses, say that it is stepbrothers that Joseph had from a previous marriage. That's how that's usually explained. We can also say, in all sincerity, at the same time, there are plenty of times in the ancient world where people would talk about brothers and sisters that were not biologically related but shared the house with you or lived nearby, sort of a extended family kind of idea where you grew up with them, you were friends with them, and they were not officially biologically related, but emotionally related, and you considered them part of your family. Any of those three can be the case. Most of the time, though, as far as I'm concerned, I will say that they are his blood brothers and sisters when they refer to them. It could go either way. We don't know, in part because, generally speaking, they are not revered in the same way that Jesus is at any point. There's not this sort of idea that because they are related to Jesus, they are part of the movement. The only exception is James, who is listed as the brother of Jesus in Acts. James is actually listed as the head of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus leaves. And James has got this sort of authority because he's related to Jesus. But it's not absolute, and he handles that in a way that seems to say that while they consider him in charge, he works with the disciples to make decisions. So, questions about Jesus' family, real quick. We'll go into the another part here in a second, but if there's any thoughts on his family or that idea.
Just a quick question. Is it anywhere in the Bible that Mary talks about the Immaculate Conception except where, the Gospels tell it, but I wonder if she told her children? Is there any record that she talked about it to anybody?
Yes. So a couple of things. One, talking about like Jesus's miraculous birth or the incarnation. That is only really referenced in Luke explicitly. It's a little bit more around the edges in Matthew. But in both cases, it's really, she ponders these things in her heart and seems to share them later on, but not at that immediate moment. The Immaculate Conception is a much later theory, and when I say much later, I think the Catholic Church approved it like in 1880, so a very recent one. But the Immaculate Conception is actually when Mary was conceived without sin, not Jesus. The Immaculate Conception is about Mary, then the Incarnation, the Feast of the Incarnation is when Jesus is conceived. So it's a different thing, and which again, then people get confused. Christmas is not the Feast of the Incarnation, it's the Feast of the Nativity. March 25th is the Incarnation when Mary becomes pregnant with Jesus. And so we all get all these lines and items confused. Does that answer your question though, Donna?
Kind of said that she doesn't really testify anywhere to people that he is a miracle. They have to believe it without her.
Not at all. Yeah, there's not that moment where she sort of goes, he's a miraculous baby and has done amazing things.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so the other thing that's referenced here is a festival of the Jews, but this one is unlike the last couple that were not explicitly listed. This one is Festival of Booths, is how it's listed in the text in Greek. In Hebrew, it would be Succoth or Sukkot. It is, for those who don't know, it's a fall harvest festival. And it was one of the three big pilgrim festivals in ancient Judaism, or Judaism in the first century. That is, there were 3 times that Jews are supposed to offer sacrifices expressly at the temple that are more or less required, if not very strongly encouraged. One was Passover. Obviously, that would be the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. You'd have Shavuot, or Pentecost, which was another actual beginning of that process. A little bit of a harvest festival. Pentecost has a whole different kind of connotation. And Succoth is the third, which is always around October, and it's the harvest. It's really the harvest festival. It's where they're the ingathering of the harvest festival and offerings. If you don't remember, the way the temple was funded, especially in that time when it was an agrarian society, was you would present a tenth of your harvest. That was where the tithe came from. It was a tenth of everything that you brought in from the land, and so that was how things were paid. And Sukkot then also celebrated. It was also this moment where Jews, and this is where it continues today, celebrate in small booths, hence the Festival of the Booths. They set up tents, usually in their yard. It's a week-long festival, and it's to remind Israel of wandering in the wilderness and ultimately the fragility of human life, right? Just to remind people that we are ultimately in sort of this in-between place too. We're not as secure as we think we are. The other side of Sukkot, it was a reminder of receiving the law of Moses. That this is that because people are outside and they're reminded of wandering in the wilderness, that's also when they received Torah, when Israel received Torah. So you have this festival, and this is still true today, that has about 3 or 4 meanings on top of each other, right? You have the Festival of Booths, they are in a booth, they're outside, they're representing wandering in the wilderness, reminding them of when they received the law, reminding them of the fragility of human life. And there's also this idea even of, because it's a Mosaic festival related to Moses, there's also this idea of, oh, well, maybe or maybe this idea that the Messiah is connected to this. The other part of it is this is our end of the liturgical calendar is the end of Pentecost. The beginning of the new year is Advent, right? That's when our readings switch over for Jews. The end of the reading of Torah for the year is Sukkot. And so then they start again with Genesis the next week after Sukkot, the next Sabbath. So again, all of this gets wrapped up in there. And it's important to name it because in the Gospel of John, whenever there's a festival, and especially when it's named, then there is an assumption that we have a little bit of an idea of what's going on because Jesus is going to have something to say specifically about that festival and the themes of that festival, right? So we'll pause there. Do you have any questions about Sukkot? I actually have, so here's just some pictures I got online, and I've had gone over and celebrated with some of the rabbis in town and with a Sukkot. It's always just sort of a little tent, and typically they have their meals out there. There are some who will literally spend the week, the full week in the tent, like living in it. Most tend to do it more of a ceremonial kind of process and have like lunch and dinner or something like that, and a feast here and there in the Sukkot more than they necessarily have a full-fledged week in a tent. All right, what else? What other questions might y'all have about Sukkot or Sukkot? I don't actually pronounce Sukkot. Or any of the other ideas here. Certainly his family rejecting him, that's a big theme.
When is Sukkot?
When? This year it's October 1st through 8th. It's always in that, I mean, it's a lunar calendar for Judaism, so it's always back and forth. It is like 2 weeks or so after the high holy days. It's all connected to that, and it's all lunar, so it can shift about a good deal.
Bill, what about Shabbat or Shavuot? What does that signify?
The Shabbat, so that's 50 days after Passover. That's what Pentecost means.
Right.
And that's typically sort of the start of the season where you're planting or you're celebrating that God's bringing life into the world in a variety of ways. I would have to go back and do more homework on exactly what Shavuot is. I don't think, I can't recall a time. I've been involved with a Sukkot, and I've been involved with a Passover Seder, and I have gone to a Purim festival even, where they celebrate the redemption with Queen Esther. But I've never actually heard or engaged anybody doing a whole lot with Shavuot. I'm not sure if it's as big a deal now on the other, since the temple was destroyed. A lot of those things have changed, and the requirements have obviously changed. So I'm not sure everything about Shavuot.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Well, look, so with especially with the Festival of the Booths in mind, that is the festival that his brothers were going up to. We can look to the next. So beginning with the 10th verse. But after his brothers had gone to the festival, then he also went, not publicly, but as it were in secret. People were looking for him at the festival and saying, "Where is he?" And there was considerable complaining about him among the crowds. While some were saying, "He is a good man," others were saying, "No, he is deceiving the crowd." So, I've said this from the start, from this Bible study. What we can say unequivocally right here is the epitome of why we can't refer to Jews with a sort of broad brush stroke, the way that sometimes people will. There were Jews looking for him, right? And some were trying to kill him, and some thought he was a good man. Like literally in this verse, we get a good idea of exactly how conflicted the community is about Jesus. It is not one sort of monolithic response to Jesus. They didn't all believe in him, and they didn't all hate him and fear him, and there were even some who just wanted to know more. They were just wondering, where is he? And so it's always important to name that, because sometimes when we hear these things like the Jews were looking for him and they were trying to kill him and all these other kinds of terms, we have to be very clear that it's not all Jews. It's this sort of group, typically leadership, that were very concerned about who Jesus was and the threat he posed to their position. So going ahead, yet no one would speak openly about him for fear of the Jews. Again, probably in that case, while the other one was broadly all the Jews gathered, for fear of the Jews, in this case, most likely is that temple leadership. They are the ones who seem to be. At the middle of the festival, Jesus went up into the temple and began to teach. The Jews were astonished at it, saying, "How does this man have such learning when he has never been taught?" Then Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Anyone who resolves to do the will of God will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own. Those who speak on their own seek their own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. There is nothing false in him. Not Moses gave you the law, yet none of you keeps the law. Why are you looking for an opportunity to kill me?" The crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who is trying to kill you?" And Jesus answered them, "I performed one work, and all of you were astonished. Moses gave you circumcision. It is, of course, not from Moses, but from the patriarchs. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. The man receives circumcision on the Sabbath in order that the law of Moses may not be broken. Are you angry with me because I healed a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." All right, so a couple of things. Jesus is listed teaching 10 times. There's 10 references to either having a teaching or teaching. In the Gospel of John, 7 of them occur right here at the start of chapter 8. Okay, so this is one of those moments where he is referred to as a teacher and teaching and having a great ability to teach. The other side of it is death, and the threat of death are a pretty major thing. Jesus is talking pretty openly about people trying to kill him, or not pretty open, completely openly. There's no hiding any of this. This is a direct conversation with the community gathered. So why does he have these two things? Again, Sukkot. Jews are celebrating receiving the law and the fragility of human life. Jesus shows up to enact and engage both, right? So he's literally showing up. I'm a teacher teaching as y'all receive the law to give you a hint about who I am. After all, God gave Moses the law. So here is Jesus as God giving the law or teaching and expanding upon it. The other side, of course, is the fragility of human life. Even though he is God, he is human. And there's this still fragile and fleeting time with everyone, right? That there's a limit. The other side of it that you can't underestimate or not talk about enough is back in John 1, in that first chapter, in what we call the prologue. It is that great line that Jesus dwelt among us, is how it gets translated most of the time. The Word was with God, and the Word was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then a few lines later, and he dwelt among us. But it can more accurately be translated to he tented among us. or tabernacled among us, which is a reference again to this idea of tenting in the wilderness. So all of this gets tied up together with this image of Jesus tenting among us, a temporary time, a temporary stay, much as Sukkoth is a temporary 8-day festival that has this. And then you have to name it, right? Jesus makes a pretty good joke about circumcision. If you recall, there was a moment earlier in this where Jesus heals the man who was trying to get in the pool. He's healed on the Sabbath, and they get very upset that he's healed on the Sabbath. And Jesus is basically making fun of them, saying, well, you'll do a circumcision. You'll cut someone on the Sabbath to fulfill the law of Moses. I'm healing the whole person, not just one little part. And y'all are getting mad about that. Does that make any sense? And it probably was a laugh line. I bet people laughed at that response, quite frankly, because it is a pretty funny and snarky comment by Jesus. He's feeling his oats, if nothing else. What else do we hear in these verses, or what questions do we have as Jesus starts to pretty openly talk? There is a shift here from what's happened before. While before people were frustrated with him or angry with him, this is the first time that Jesus is really openly talking about people trying to kill him. So we've got a shift there in tone that we will see for the rest of the gospel, really, until the crucifixion itself, that he is very clear that people are trying to get him.
Billy, you alluded to it earlier, but it does make you wonder how we would receive somebody like this. Would we just think they're totally off their rocker and write them off if we encountered this today?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. If it was like a little boy that you had known since he was a small child, and you think, oh, well, he's just my neighbor, you know.
Right. There's a great, I think it's in Luke, where there's some people who are like, don't we know him? Isn't he Mary and Joseph's son? I mean, there's very much this sort of comment from the crowd, like, yeah, he grew up around the corner. He's stories about that guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing we can say, referencing just here in verse 15 that I pulled up, the Jews were astonished at it, saying, how does this man have such learning when he has never been taught? Judaism then and now is very similar in that you learn from other rabbis, right? Same with Christianity. I go to seminary. That's where Casey's going this week. She'll head up to New York to begin her process, and she will learn from professors and clergy, other priests, about how to teach and how to share the good news of the Gospels and of the text, right? It's the same for rabbis. They go to rabbinical school and spend years in training. And really, actually, this is a fascinating thing at this era, because everything that, books are so rare. This is pretty crazy, but one of the first requirements of rabbis in this era was to memorize the Torah. All of it. All 5 books completely memorized in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And then you would learn, typically you would memorize the prophets as well, if not the Psalms. So most of the Old Testament was required to be committed to memory just to become a rabbi, much less than the advanced teachings from, the different texts and programs beyond that. So they're basically looking at this guy going like, he did not spend time doing all that kind of stuff that the rest of the rabbis, the rest of the teachers would do. And it is a good question, right? I mean, it's that same kind of thing, Karen, of, wait a second, how does this guy claim to know anything? He hasn't spent any time learning all this stuff the way we have. Has spent years of his life dedicated to this, to understand the teaching. And his answer, I mean, if you're just listening and you're sort of trying to understand it, his answers are not ones that you would, feel too strong about, right? I mean, it's sort of like, well, how does this guy know all this stuff? Well, sort of his response is, I'm good friends with God. I talk to God. I pray with him, and I want to help everybody get there. which isn't a wrong answer. It's a good answer, but it's not one that would probably satisfy anybody who's wanting to know who he learned from. Especially in that era, you had these ideas that there were certain rabbinical schools, even like there was the rabbinical school of Hillel, or the rabbinical school of one teacher or another who's considered, and they still will talk about that, right? Hillel is still considered one of the great rabbis of all time, who was a rough contemporary of Jesus. And so a lot of times they'll talk about like Hillel taught this, or Hillel and the rabbis who learned from him learned this, right? And so you could almost be divided up by your classes as well, the people who prescribed or followed certain rabbis. He didn't have any of those credentials. So some of this is the good old-fashioned big city learning versus small-town kid kind of conversation too, right? He didn't go to Harvard. He didn't go to Yale. How's this guy from nowhere supposed to know all this stuff? We'll keep pushing on then to the next. The story continues. Now, some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, "Is not this the man whom they are trying to kill? And here he is, speaking openly." But they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Messiah? Yet we know where this man is from. But when the Messiah comes, no one will know where he is from. And Jesus cried out as he was teaching in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I am from. I come on my own. But the one who sent me is true, and you do not know him. I know him because I am from him, and he sent me." So with these little two verses, we have this great sort of back and forth with Jesus engaging and talking to them. But you have even better this sort of almost internal argument within the crowd that says like, oh, well, if they're trying to kill him, but they're not killing him, then maybe they know that he is somebody special. Usually, if there's a real problem, they take care of him. But maybe this guy is the Messiah because they want to kill him, but they haven't. It's sort of a fascinating logic train, right? And then, but at the same time, we know where he's from, and he's supposed to be from, and this is really a reference to, again, Jesus grew up in Nazareth, but the Messiah is supposed to be from Bethlehem. So it's, again, that kind of thing of he's not from the right town, he's not from the right place, he's not from the best people that we can tell. All these other kinds of things are questions, which Jesus then, in classic John fashion, you've got two conversations going on, right? They're talking about literally knowing where he's from. We know Mary and we know Joseph. But Jesus is talking on a much more spiritual level, right? You know me and you know where I am from. I have not come on my own. He's talking much more about being sent by God and having that deep connection with God, not necessarily Nazareth or his parents or his brothers who don't believe him anyway, right? So you have these sort of classic, again, Jesus is talking on one level, they're talking on a different level, and they're not always hearing each other in this conversation. So after that, they tried to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come. And many in the crowd believed in him and were saying, when the Messiah comes, will he do more signs than this man has done? The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering such things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent temple police to arrest him. Jesus then said, I will be with you a little while longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. You will search for me, but you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come. We said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks, teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying, you will search for me and you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? All right, so the Gospel of John, especially, it starts to pick up here. There are many, many references to two different ideas. The hour, it was not yet Jesus's hour, and it was not yet time for his glory. You'll hear those references. They're used pretty interchangeably. And it is counterintuitive for us to think about it, but in the Gospel of John, they both expressly refer to his crucifixion. Okay? That is his moment of glory. That is his moment. That is his hour. Not the hour of temptation. A lot of times people will think about, when they talks about it is my hour. Luke uses that term to say like it is his hour of struggle and his hour of worry, and he has that hour of agony, that time of agony in the garden, right? But in John, it is expressly when he is crucified. That is the moment of his glory. That is his highest point. For John, Jesus' greatest moment, the whole reason for coming is to be raised up, to be killed, to be sacrificed. It is absolutely the focus for the Gospel of John. Now, what we have to be clear is the point of that is so that we might believe, so that we can see that God comes into the world, and what does the world do? The world that is violent and is evil, of course, rejects God. It is not of God. That's the system that John understands this whole thing to work on. It is not, however, what you've heard probably preached a million times. It's not a payment for sin, because that's not even part of the Johannine system. You haven't heard Jesus or John in any way, shape, or form talk about like, this is all about sin. This is all about paying for sin or a payment for redemption in sin, right? It's not about that in the text. It's much more about this idea that we might believe, and we believe because, of course, in a world that is evil and it represses and rejects God, is going to reject Jesus. Therefore, that is proof that Jesus is God. Of course they would kill him. What else would you do with a prophet? But again, there's not always clarity on exactly how this works, why exactly Jesus has to die. It's just sort of a broadly inferred conversation, which is why people then end up adding things about payment for sin and lots of other, as I taught in my other class, how does Jesus save it? It all gets caught up in these different theories of atonement. John's not worried about atonement. He's worried about us believing in Jesus. That's the most important. That's the references again in this section for the hour of his death, the hour of his glory, the hour, his hour has not yet come. And again, you have this idea that, try to put hands on him, but they couldn't, right? Verse 30. Then they tried to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come. There's this idea, too, that Jesus is completely in charge, and that until it's time for him to be crucified, it's not going to happen, even if they want to. It's going to happen when he's good and ready. It wasn't time, so they weren't able to lay hands on him. Not because someone told him not to, not because Jesus even said no. It was just his hour had not yet come, and either he slipped away or they backed off because they were impressed with his teaching, or no one knew exactly what to do. It's not clear on exactly why. It's just that his hour hadn't come, so not time to do it yet. What else do we hear or see or have questions about in this text?
So I have a question. I think it was on maybe the prior slide or two,
Mm-hmm.
and you were talking about that Jesus' purpose was to die, but you used the word sacrifice right above that. So to me, a sacrifice means something you do to help somebody else, right? Or to please a God. So was it to be a sacrifice? Or was it just to die because he had to die?
The Christology of John, that is the teaching about who Jesus is as the Christ, is actually the most clear for Good Friday. And in that moment, he is the Lamb of God. He is the Passover Lamb who was sacrificed for us. And that is, our death is averted because of the death of the Lamb. In the same way when they killed the Lamb in the Exodus, right? And they smeared his blood over the door for the lamb so that the angel of death would pass over them. There's a direct line that John makes between that Passover lamb and Jesus is our Passover lamb who saves us from the hour of death, or saves us from death and gives us eternal life. So there is this idea that the sacrifice is to our benefit, that we get the benefit of having life and being connected to God, but it is very different. The Passover lamb is not a sacrifice to take away sin, right? So it is a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice of thanksgiving for what God does and to be connected with God, not a sacrifice to save us from sinfulness, brokenness, and all that. That's the Day of Atonement, right? That's a whole different concept in Judaism. And so by making that connection to the Passover, it has this idea that we are saved from death and perhaps the punishment that comes with being people that are not following God all the time and broken and sinful. But it's not expressly for sin because of that theology is just, there's literally a scapegoat and a whole.
And Bill, did you say the other gospel writers do connect atonement for sin with Jesus's death, or does that come later in the?
That comes a little bit later, and even then, not always sin. There's what we can say unequivocally, the absolutely clear thing is that all four gospel writers spend fully 1/3 of the books, a third of each gospel is dedicated to the crucifixion and the moments around that the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the resurrection, right? 1/3 of the book. All three are clearly struggling with why did Jesus have to die? They're struggling with what does it mean? They're struggling with even with Easter and what it means, right? They're struggling with this huge moment of life and death. They all know it's important. They all spend a lot of time talking about it. None of them have a systematic theology around it. That is, it's sort of ultimately, well, not sort of, it is ultimately a mystery. I think all four gospel writers would probably say that they know it's important, they know it matters, but what exactly God is doing in that moment, we're not sure, as much as it matters because it happened and because Jesus says it matters and because it mattered to the church, the people who saw it and were there. But exactly what it does, exactly sort of like, oh, this happened because this happened because this happened, which is that sort of more of a systematic theology, is not in any of the four Gospels. What we see later is a little bit of Paul wrestling with what does it mean in some of the epistles, but most of our real teaching about atonement and 100 other things come from the earliest church fathers preaching and teaching about it and trying to make sense of it. How do you share this message and what does it mean that Jesus was born, died, and raised, right? That we start to have more of these, okay, well, it means this, and it comes to this, and it comes to this, and the sinfulness in this. What most scholars really think happened more than anything else is they could not name, that is, the first disciples and those first generations could not fully always name everything theologically that was going on, but what they did know was that they felt closer to God on the other side of it than they did before it. That there was a level of reconciliation and of atonement that had a visceral emotional response, right? That they could name that this death, this brutal crucifixion, and this resurrection led to life and to second chances and to a new way of being. They weren't always as concerned about Good Friday as we can be. They were more concerned about somehow through this mysterious process, we have been reconciled to God and to each other. Does that help? This is one of those, it's hard because we have to peel back 2,000 years of preaching and teaching that have ideas laid on top of ideas that laid on top of ideas. What exactly the first century folks understood or knew is not completely clear. We can't name that. Even for the Gospel of John, right? What we could say is that idea again of the Passover lamb, or John 3:16, right? For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son to the end that all believe in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So we're saved from death. We're giving this eternal life with God, but there's not sin mentioned in that. There's not punishment necessarily mentioned in that. There's sort of this idea that something else could happen, that death is a possible option, but that the real purpose is is that idea of reconciliation, of being connected to God. All right, we'll look ahead real quick. There's not too much left in this chapter, and it's all related to this anyway. On the last day of the festival, the great day, while Jesus was standing there, he cried out, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." Now he said this about the Spirit, which believers in him were to receive, for as yet there was no Spirit, because Jesus was not yet glorified. I should pause right there and say, Christian theology would say, of course there was a Holy Spirit before this, but Jesus hadn't sent the Spirit because he hadn't been crucified. That when Jesus talks later about the Spirit coming, he refers to the Spirit as coming when he leaves. So there's sort of a order to that, but there's not necessarily that the Spirit doesn't exist. When they heard these words, some in the crowd said, "This is really the prophet." Others said, "This is the Messiah." But some said, "Surely the Messiah does not come from Galilee. Has not the scripture said that the Messiah is descended from David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David lived?" So there was a division in the crowd because of him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. So again, we have this sort of classic exchange among faithful Jews about who the Messiah is. Who's Jesus? There's not one argument at all. They're all disagreeing about different things. Is he a prophet? Is he a king in the line of David? Is he a healer? Is he from Nazareth? Is he from Bethlehem? All kinds of things, and people are all arguing about which it could be. There's not consensus. And while this might be a literal argument, I would argue that this whole chapter is really our continuing argument. Who do we believe Jesus is? Right? This, while it is sort of put on the crowd to wrestle with, I think the purpose for John sharing this whole sequence is for us to ask these questions. Right? Say, well, does he have to be from Bethlehem? Does he have to be of the line of David? Because in the Gospel of John, there's no lineage that says he's from the David line. That comes from Luke. Does he have to be a healer? Does he have to be a prophet? What does this mean? I think is the question that we're really being sort of pushed through by John to say, like, here are what people say, and here's some ideas. We have to wrestle with it. So the temple priests then went back to the chief priests and Pharisees, who asked him, "Why did you not arrest him?" The police answered, "Never has anyone spoken like this." The Pharisees replied, "Surely you have not been deceived too, have you? Has any one of the authorities or of the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd, which does not know the law, they are accursed." Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus before and who was one of them, asked, "Our law does not judge people without first giving them a hearing to find out what they are doing, does it?" They replied, "Surely you're not also from Galilee, are you? Search, and you will see that no prophet is to arise from Galilee."
Oh, they're not impressed with Galilee.
They're not too impressed with Galilee. This is also a pretty comedic exchange. It's that classic thing. The temple police don't want to arrest Jesus because they're pretty impressed with what he's teaching and saying. And then the temple authorities are going like, "Well, no one here believes it." And then Nicodemus immediately speaks up and goes, "Well, you're supposed to at least try him, right?" He doesn't out himself as a follower of Jesus, but we know, because he already had this conversation with Jesus, that he probably is a disciple, and he speaks up on Jesus's behalf, even if they don't realize that he is not on their side. Mm-hmm. Then we're also given a pretty harsh portrait of the leadership, right? They're so obsessed with Jesus, they're so angry about what is happening that they'll break their own rules to get rid of it, right? They're supposed to have a trial. If someone's being accused of blasphemy or accused of saying things falsely or whatever else, Judaism, ancient Judaism and modern Judaism are both the same as our judicial system, right? There's supposed to be a trial here before you decide someone is deserving of death or deserving of punishment. There's at least supposed to be some kind of conversation. But they're so mad they don't care. And even more, they go right to ad hominem attacks on Nicodemus. If you don't remember your rhetoric rules, ad hominem attacks are when you can't win your argument through logic, then you attack the person ad hominem. You talk about how the person looks stupid, or, "Oh, well, you must be from Galilee too." It's because
Yeah.
you end up just attacking the person, which we could have a lot of conversation probably about current national discourse. There's lots of ad hominem attacks. Now, I feel like we have far more ad hominem attacks than substance of any kind for what are either party proposing. It's don't go with that one, he's evil. Don't go with that one, he's evil kind of model. It's all ad hominem instead of it being about the ideas. In rhetoric, you're really supposed to debate the issue, not the person. But I think those rules are long forgotten nowadays. What else? That's the end of the chapter. Anything else from the whole chapter? We're right at that time.
So I have a Jewish faith question.
Mm-hmm.
So are the Jews still expecting a Messiah, and they don't do sacrifices now? Why?
So the second one is the answer to both is pretty straightforward. Yes, Jews would still say that they're waiting for the Messiah. They're waiting for the Messiah to come. And their critique that any rabbi would share with you easily is that the great critique of Jesus is that when the Messiah comes, it's supposed to issue a season of God's reign, of shalom, of peace. And the most fundamental question that any rabbi would ask is, well, where's the peace? If Jesus was the Messiah, where is the peace that's promised afterward? This peace of and throughout the world. And so that's the great critique of Christianity from the Jewish perspective, right? That Jesus came and had some great things to say, and he might have even been an exceptional gut prophet, but he couldn't be the Messiah because he doesn't bring that peace. He doesn't bring that reconciliation of the world to God on the level that is promised. The second part of your question, why are there no longer sacrifices? Well, that's it all literally happened at the Council of Jamnia in 70 AD, or 72, might have been 72. Right after the temple was burned down, after Rome sacked and destroyed the temple, a group of rabbis met and said, well, what do we do now? Basically, like the place where we're supposed to sacrifice animals has been destroyed, right? The place that is prescribed for us to go and worship, to have sacrifice of like the Passover lamb, to offer our different offerings at different points, is literally destroyed. What does it mean to be Jewish now? What do we do? And they redefined Judaism at that council into what it is today, which is animal sacrifices are not needed. It's much more about sharing of gifts and wealth than literally like giving 2 turtle doves for because you touched a dead body or whatever the variety, but all the various rules and regulations about offerings that were required, purifying a woman after childbirth, all these different things that you were supposed to offer at the temple. All of that went away when the temple went away, effectively. And they started to redefine, largely at the Council of Jamnia, really sort of got us to exactly where Judaism is now in its current system, which is that system where you don't have to sacrifice animals and you don't go to one central location as much as worship in a local community and local gatherings. Yeah.
Where did purify a woman after childbirth come from?
That's the law of Moses. It's referenced in the Gospel of Luke when Mary and Joseph go with Jesus to the temple. There's after the woman has given birth, and it's 8 days for the naming of the child, and then 40 days after birth, there's a purification ritual. And really, it's sort of also a thanksgiving that the mom is okay and the baby's okay. There's a sort of combination, but all that happens 40 days after, and it's like 2 turtle doves, and if you don't have enough for turtle doves, then you can do this, or I can't, there's all these different rules about it, but it's a part of that law of Moses.
Well, I can understand the thanksgiving for the safe delivery and what have you, but I still don't. To me, purification says, "Are you've been a bad person," you know?
No, so that's one of the big things that Christians confuse with purity code in Judaism. It's not about being a bad person. There was great concern about blood, right? That a woman was unclean when she bled. And childbirth obviously is also bloody. So it was that same kind of thing. You just need to be purify does not literally mean like, oh, you've done something bad. It is, you just need to be made clean. Purification after menstruation in Judaism was literally, you take a bath. It was not like, oh my gosh, no one can ever be near you and you're forever tainted. No. And it's not like you're evil or you're bad. It was always seen as a gift, and the gift that it is that you can bear children. But what it is about is just saying, but it's also a period where you were unclean. And so then you just need to take a bath. And that's, sometimes you'll hear preachers and teachers in Christianity fundamentally misunderstanding, making that connection to say purification, somebody wasn't pure, is this horrible thing and Jesus has come to change all of that. No, I mean, it's the same thing. Like there's another rule about touching dead people, right? You're not supposed to touch dead people because in the ancient world, if someone was dead, that tended to carry disease, either what killed them or very shortly after death, the body starts to have all these bacteria that can get you sick. And the same thing was true if you touched a dead body in the ancient world. You were unclean and you need to be purified, which was go take a bath, go wash your hands. It was not super complex. That's what they're arguing about in the gospel lesson from this past Sunday, right? They're like, Jesus doesn't wash his hands before supper. It's not to say that he is somehow terrible and unclean and unworthy. It's, dude, you've been in the field all day, wash your hands, right? I mean, that's really what the question that they have to Jesus is, much the same way that we would literally right now, right? In our current pandemic, you need to wash your hands. That you're going to get sick if you don't wash your hands. There's just ways that you should order your life to be clean, and not because you're horrible if you're unclean, but you're taking risks that aren't necessary. What else do we have? Anything else, my friends? All right. Well, to look ahead, next week we'll look at chapter 8. So it has a little bit more about the story, and there's some continuation. But then we have this literally one of the most beloved stories in Scripture. It only appears in the Gospel of John. But it's completely a late edition. Every scholar has agreed we have found copies of the Gospel of John that do not have the story. Anybody want to guess? Does anybody know what that story is? It's completely a late edition. Most everybody believes it's an added story to the Gospel, and it only appears in the Gospel of John. Does anybody know what that one is? It is the woman caught in adultery, and when Jesus says, "You who is without sin, cast the first stone." Mm-hmm. It is one that does not appear until either the 2nd or 3rd century. Like it's a good 150 years later. They found some versions of John that don't have. Clearly, somebody thought the story was important enough to include, and they slipped it in there, and it became canon, became part of our text. But probably was not John's original story. That's okay. It is a great story. We'll have fun with that next week.
That's so interesting.
It is. It's fun. It's fun to see all this stuff. What else do we have, my friends? Anything else we want to talk about or share?
Oh, I got a text that was negative.
What'd you say?
Maybe that's.
I'm glad your daughter's well.
Wait, I didn't hear. What'd you say, Karen?
I got a text from Avery that the COVID test was negative, so maybe she something
excellent.
else. But her coworkers got it too, whatever it is. So,
Oh, I'm glad it's not COVID.
I know.
Oh goodness! I feel like we're all going to be doing that all fall. If it's a head cold, and everybody's going to be running to get tests.
We get all worried. Yeah.
The season's going to shift, and we'll all be getting the usual things and be wondering about it. The other, I would invite your prayers for Jan Paul, Rusty Paul's wife. Her sister died yesterday, the day before. She'd been sick for a while and on the hospice and a variety of issues, but just keep the Pauls in your prayer as they mourn and deal with the process. She's actually in Baltimore. The sister was in Baltimore, so they'll be going up there. But just keep them all in your prayers. It's a hard time. always hard when someone dies, but especially hard in this season of social distancing and not being able to gather in the same way too. All right. So good to be with all of you. Have a great day, and we will see you soon.
Thank
All
you.
right.
See you
Bye-bye.
tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right.